in the tranquility of the southwestern Chinese mountains, where nature presents itself in its purest form and life follows an almost ancestral rhythm. There is a winding road that cuts through a dense forest. The morning mist often hangs over this road, making it mysterious and enchanting. The thick vegetation is home to various creatures, including a species that, for many, represents the essence of vulnerability and wild beauty: the giant panda. The road, almost always deserted, was known only to the locals and the adventurous tourists who dared to travel it in hopes of catching a glimpse of these majestic bears. The bucolic scenery hid an intriguing contrast. On one hand, the majesty of the mountains and the vastness of the forest. On the other, the fragility of a species in danger, struggling for its survival in a world that seemed increasingly smaller. On a day that began like any other, Jia, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and an expression that bore the weight of the world, was behind the wheel of his old car. Jia was a local, but his heart was far away. He found himself in a state of deep anguish, caused by his daughter May's illness. At just 8 years old, little May had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition that required urgent treatment in a distant city. Jia had a monumental task ahead of him: getting his daughter to the hospital, facing not only the challenging road, but also the constant fear of losing control of the car on the sharp curves. The sound of the old engine struggling against the road's inclines was a constant reminder of the precariousness of the situation. As he drove, Jia's thoughts wandered among memories of happy days with May, before the illness had manifested. He remembered her laughter as they ran through the rice fields, the sparkle in her eyes when she saw the cherry blossoms bloom in the spring. Now, that sparkle had been replaced by a shadow of pain and uncertainty. Jia felt helpless, as if he were losing the battle against time. The road seemed endless, and each curve was a challenge that tested Jia's strength and the car's endurance. But Jia knew he couldn't give up. He needed to get May to the hospital. He needed to save the one person who gave his life meaning. It was a lonely journey, but Jia found solace in the landscape around him. The mountains were silent witnesses to his struggle, and the forest, with its secrets and mysteries, seemed to murmur words of encouragement. It was in this setting of silent despair and unyielding determination that the story took an unexpected turn. Jia was focused on the road, his eyes fixed on the horizon, when something unusual appeared in front of him. About 20 meters away, a shadow emerged from the forest, moving slowly towards the road. Jia gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes widening as he tried to identify the figure approaching. And then he saw it. In the middle of the road, standing as if deliberately blocking the way, was a panda. Not just any panda, but a mother panda with her cub, both with soft fur and the tender gaze that only this species can have. Jia slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road until it stopped just a few meters from the animals. Jia's heart was racing, not just from the sudden stop, but from the scene unfolding before him. The mother panda seemed to be looking directly at him, as if she were trying to convey a silent message. The cub, small and fragile, was beside her, trying to imitate his mother's movements but clearly exhausted and weak. Jia didn't know what to do. He was in a race against time, but something in that gaze made him hesitate. The mother panda, without fear or hesitation, began to move toward the car, the cub following closely behind. Jia remained still, his heart torn between the urgency of saving his daughter and the sudden compassion he felt for these animals. The forest around them seemed to watch in silence, as if waiting for Jia's next move. And then, in that moment of silence, something deeply touched Jia's soul. He realized that it was no coincidence that he encountered the pandas there. In that remote place, on that lonely road, the fates of Jia and the pandas had crossed for a reason. Jia knew he had to do something, but what? He was faced with a difficult choice, one that would require courage and compassion. A choice that, he felt, would change everything. And so began the story that would touch not only Jia's life, but those of everyone who would hear about that improbable encounter between a man, his sick daughter, and two pandas on a remote road in the mountains of China. A story that, in the end, would touch the soul of all who participated in it, revealing the beauty of the connection between living beings and the power of love and hope. Jia was paralyzed for a moment, staring at the scene before him. He had never seen a panda so close, much less in such a strange situation. It was as if time had stopped. What could have led the mother panda to bring her cub to the middle of the road? And why at that exact moment, when Jia was desperately racing against time to save his daughter? May, sitting in the back seat, was awake but too weak to speak. She, too, noticed the pandas through the window, her tired eyes fixed on the two animals. There was something almost magical about the scene, as if the pandas were messengers of something greater, something Jia couldn't yet understand. He turned to look at his daughter, and the look she gave him was one of silent understanding. She didn't have the strength to speak, but her gaze conveyed a clear message. There was no rush, not at that moment. Jia knew that every minute was precious, but something in his heart told him that this encounter had a purpose. He slowly opened the car door and stepped out, his movements slow as if he were in a trance. The mother panda watched him intently, but without showing any signs of aggression. The cub was visibly exhausted, its steps hesitant and heavy. Jia approached cautiously, his paternal instincts mingling with compassion for these defenseless animals. He stopped a few meters from the pandas, and the mother panda did something that Jia never expected. She gently nudged the cub towards him. The little panda fell to the side, clearly weakened. Jia knelt down, unsure of what to do. He looked at the mother panda, who remained still, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. In that instant, Jia understood that the cub was sick, perhaps even dying, and the mother, somehow, knew that Jia could help. Jia's internal conflict grew. He had his own sick daughter to care for, but the silent plea of the mother panda was impossible to ignore. Jia felt torn between his responsibilities as a father and the urgency of helping these helpless animals. He knew he didn't have much time or resources, but something inside him pushed him to do the impossible. Without thinking twice, Jia returned to the car and opened the trunk. He always kept a small first aid kit there, a reflection of his constant caution while living in such a remote area. He grabbed the kit and returned to where the cub lay. His movements were slow and careful, fearing to scare the mother panda or cause more suffering to the cub. Jia knew that his medical skills were limited, but he also knew he couldn't just turn his back. He began to examine the cub, his eyes searching for visible injuries or something he could treat. The little panda was warm to the touch, its breathing irregular and labored. Jia suspected a fever, but without proper equipment, he could only attempt the basics. He used cold compresses to try to lower the cub's temperature, while the mother panda watched with an almost human attentiveness. Jia felt the weight of responsibility growing on his shoulders. He was trying to save a life, but he knew his efforts might not be enough. Despair began to take hold of him, but he forced himself to continue, driven by a sense of duty that transcended his own concerns. After some time, Jia realized he had done all he could. He looked at the mother panda, who was still there, unmoved. She seemed to understand what Jia had done, and in a slow motion, she approached the cub and cradled it in her arms. Jia watched as the mother panda licked the cub gently, trying to comfort it. Jia stood up, feeling powerless, but at the same time, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He knew he had done his best, that he had tried to help, even though the odds were slim. He looked at the road ahead, still shrouded in mist, and realized that his journey was far from over. He returned to the car, closing the door carefully so as not to disturb the pandas. When he sat back behind the wheel, May was watching him with a look of understanding and tenderness. Jia didn't need words to know that his daughter was proud of him, that she understood what he had done and why. And then, something unexpected happened. The mother panda, carrying her cub in her arms, began to move away from the road, returning to the forest. Jia watched in silence as they disappeared among the trees, the mist slowly swallowing them. For a brief moment, he felt a deep connection with those animals, as if they had shared more than just a road. Jia knew there were no guarantees that the cub would survive, just as there were no guarantees that May would overcome her illness. But in that moment, he felt a renewed hope. He believed that, somehow, that unexpected encounter had a greater meaning, a reminder that even in the most desperate situations, there is always room for compassion and kindness. He started the car again, feeling the engine respond with renewed strength. The road was still long, but Jia knew he was on the right path. And as he drove, with Mei by his side, he felt that, in some way, the pandas would be with them, guiding them on their journey. The winding road stretched out before Jia, the mist beginning to dissipate as the sun slowly rose in the sky. The silence inside the car was almost absolute, interrupted only by the soft sound of Mei's breathing. She had fallen asleep, exhausted from the long journey and the tension of the encounter with the pandas. Jia, on the other hand, was lost in thought. The unexpected encounter had deeply affected him, but the weight of responsibility still bore heavily on his shoulders. He needed to reach the hospital as quickly as possible. However, fate had other plans. As Jia continued driving, a slight tremor began to course through the steering wheel. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the rough state of the road, but the shaking quickly worsened. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the car, followed by a metallic clanging sound. Jia knew immediately that something was wrong. He started to slow down, but before he could come to a complete stop, the car jerked violently and lost control, skidding dangerously on the road. Jia fought to keep the car under control, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the vehicle finally came to a halt, leaning against an embankment on the side of the road. Jia's heart pounded as he tried to comprehend what had happened. He looked at Mei, who was still asleep, miraculously undisturbed by the incident. After taking a few deep breaths to calm his nerves, Jia stepped out of the car to assess the damage. The problem was worse than he had imagined. One of the wheels had partially detached, likely due to the combination of the rough road and the old car's condition. Jia knelt down to inspect the situation, realizing that without proper tools, fixing the car would be nearly impossible. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was on a deserted road, with no cell phone signal, no way to call for help, and with a sick daughter who desperately needed to get to the hospital. He returned to the car, feeling the weight of his situation. Mei was still asleep, unaware of the drama unfolding around her. Jia looked at the horizon, where the mountains seemed to mock his predicament. The dense forest surrounding them was impenetrable, and there wasn't a building or house in sight. Jia was completely alone, and for the first time, he felt that perhaps he wouldn't be able to go on. But then, a memory came to him. The image of the mother panda, holding her cub with such care and confidence, resonated in his mind. Jia remembered the look in her eyes, a look that seemed to say that even in the most difficult situations, there is always a way forward. Inspired by this memory, Jia decided that he couldn't give up. There was a chance, however small, that he could find help or even fix the car. He just had to try. He got out of the car again, this time with renewed determination. As he searched for the toolbox in the trunk, something caught his attention. On the ground, near the car, were small footprints, different from the panda's tracks. Jia crouched down to take a closer look and realized that the footprints were fresh, as if the animal that left them had passed by recently. Curious and desperate, Jia decided to follow the trail. He knew he was taking a risk by leaving the car and Mei behind, but he felt that something was guiding him, that those footprints could lead him to a solution. He walked along the road, following the tracks that slowly veered away from the asphalt and into the forest. The dense vegetation quickly enveloped him, the sound of leaves crunching under his feet, the only noise breaking the absolute silence of the forest. The walk didn't last long. Jia soon spotted something in the distance, a small wooden cabin hidden among the trees. The trail of footprints ended there. Jia approached cautiously, hopeful yet apprehensive. The cabin looked old but well-maintained, as if someone still lived there. Jia felt a spark of hope grow in his chest. Maybe here he would find someone who could help him. He knocked on the door, feeling his heart race again, this time with expectation. For a moment, nothing happened. Jia was about to knock again when the door slowly opened, revealing an elderly figure. An old man with white hair, gentle eyes, and a warm smile appeared at the door. He looked at Jia with curiosity, as if he had been expecting his arrival. "Can I help you?" the old man asked, his voice soft and calm. Jia felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed with emotion. "My car broke down on the road," he began, his voice trembling. "My daughter is sick, and I need to get her to the hospital, but—" The old man raised his hand to gently interrupt him. "Calm down, my friend. Let's see what we can do," he said, already grabbing a coat and stepping out the door. The two of them returned to Jia's car, where May was still sleeping peacefully. The old man carefully examined the situation, his experienced eyes noticing every detail. After a few minutes, he turned to Jia with a calm smile. "We can fix this," he said, with a confidence that eased Jia's heart. "It'll take a little time, but you and your daughter will be back on the road before you know it." The relief Jia felt was indescribable. For the first time in hours, he felt that maybe things would be okay. He helped the old man bring tools from the cabin, and together they began working on the car. The forest around them, which had previously seemed inhospitable and threatening, now seemed to protect them, as if it were rooting for everything to turn out well. As they worked, the old man began to tell stories about his life, about how he had retreated to the forest years ago to live in peace with nature. Jia listened intently, feeling a growing connection with this man who had suddenly become his only hope. And as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Jia felt a strange certainty that this encounter was no accident. Just like the pandas, the old man from the forest seemed to have appeared on his path at the exact moment he needed it most. Jia didn't know yet what the future held, but he knew that, somehow, he and May would get through this ordeal together. Time seemed to slow down as Jia and the elderly man worked together to repair the car. Every movement was made with care, and despite the desperate situation, Jia felt a growing sense of peace. There was something comforting about the presence of the old man, as if he were more than just a stranger found by chance on the road. The sun was already beginning to set, casting a deep orange hue across the sky, when the old man finally tightened the last loose bolt on the wheel. "Done," he said with a satisfied smile, wiping his grease-stained hands. "Now, let's test it." Jia, with his heart full of hope, got into the car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the car seemed to respond with renewed vitality. Jia let out a sigh of relief, feeling tears well up in his eyes. He turned to the old man, who was watching him with a look of deep understanding. "I don't know how to thank you," Jia began, but the man raised his hand once more, gently interrupting him. "There's no need to thank me, my friend. You have a long journey ahead of you and a daughter who needs you. Go on, and remember that sometimes help comes from where we least expect it." Jia nodded, emotional. He stepped out of the car to say goodbye, but before he could leave, the old man extended something to him, a small wooden box, intricately carved with delicate bamboo patterns. Jia took it, confused, but the man simply smiled. "It's a gift," the old man said. "Something to remind you that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is always a reason to believe." Jia thanked him again, holding the small box as if it were a treasure. He got back into the car, waving one last time to the old man before returning to the road. The car, now repaired, moved smoothly along the winding curves of the mountain road. Night was falling, and the moon began to appear, casting a silver glow over the forest. May was still asleep, and Jia found himself watching her in the rear-view mirror. She looked so peaceful, as if she were dreaming of something sweet. Jia felt a pang in his heart as he thought about everything she had already been through and all that was still to come. But now, unlike before, he felt a renewed confidence. He had faced challenges, but he had also found help and kindness where he least expected it. The road seemed less threatening now, and Jia realized that he was closer to the hospital. The city lights began to appear in the distance, a sign that the journey was nearing its end. Jia gripped the steering wheel with determination, knowing that he couldn't give up now. He thought about the old man and what he had said, about the help that appears unexpectedly, and he felt grateful for everything he had encountered on the road. Finally, the lights of the hospital appeared ahead, shining like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Ja parked the car and carefully lifted May into his arms. She was still weak, but her eyes opened briefly, and she smiled at her father as if knowing she was safe. Ja felt tears streaming down his face as he carried his daughter into the hospital. The doctors received her immediately, taking her to the emergency room. Ja stood there, feeling powerless once again, but this time he had something that comforted him. He held the small wooden box the old man had given him, as if it were a talisman of hope. Ja sat in the waiting room, the box clutched in his hands, and prayed silently for May to be okay. The next few hours were a blur of waiting and anxiety. Doctors came and went from the room, but Ja could barely comprehend what they were saying. His mind was fixated on one thought: his daughter needed to survive. He knew there was nothing more he could do except wait and trust the doctor's skills. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the doctors emerged from the room, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. Ja immediately stood up, his heart racing. "How is she?" Ja asked, his voice trembling. The doctor smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "She's a strong little girl. We managed to stabilize her, but we still need to monitor her closely. With time and proper treatment, I believe she'll be okay." Ja felt his legs give way with relief, tears finally escaping his eyes. He thanked the doctor repeatedly, unable to contain the gratitude he felt. May was alive, and there was hope for her. It was all he could have asked for. When Ja was finally allowed to see May, she was lying in a hospital bed, still pale but with a faint smile on her face. Ja approached slowly, sitting by her side and holding her small hand. She looked at him, her eyes shining with renewed strength. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. "I knew you would bring me here. I knew everything would be okay." Ja smiled through his tears, gently stroking his daughter's hair. "Yes, my little one. Everything is going to be okay. I promise I'll always be by your side." May closed her eyes again, resting, but with a peace that Ja hadn't seen in a long time. He looked at the small wooden box in his hands and felt that, somehow, that gift was more than just an object. It was a symbol of the journey they had taken, of the kindness they had encountered along the way, and of the hope that, despite everything, had never abandoned them. Ja remained by May's side as she slept, the steady rhythm of her breathing bringing a sense of tranquility that he hadn't felt in a long time. The small wooden box, now resting on the bedside table, seemed to radiate a calming energy, as if it were watching over May's rest. Ja couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened that day: the encounter with the pandas, the car breakdown, the elderly man who had appeared like a guardian angel. It all seemed part of a larger plan, something he couldn't fully understand yet, but that somehow filled him with a sense of purpose. The days that followed were challenging, but also filled with hope. May underwent several surgeries, and with each one, the doctors were surprised by the strength she demonstrated. Ja spent most of his time by her side, holding her hand and telling stories to keep her calm. He talked about the mountains, the forest, the pandas that had crossed their path. Stories that now seemed almost fantastical, but that to him were more real than anything else. During one of those long afternoons at the hospital, May finally asked about the wooden box. Ja took the small object, the bamboo carvings still gleaming despite the journey, and placed it in May's hands. She looked at the box with childlike curiosity, but also with a reverence that seemed far beyond her age. "Do you want to open it?" Ja asked softly. May nodded, and with delicate fingers, she opened the lid of the box. Inside, there lay a single bamboo leaf, green and vibrant, as if it had been picked that very moment. May carefully took the leaf, her eyes shining with admiration. "Daddy, is this magic?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Ja smiled, feeling the weight of emotions building in his chest. "In a way, yes," he replied. "It's a reminder that even in the hardest times, life always finds a way to continue." Just like bamboo grows strong and resilient, you too will recover and become strong again. May clutched the bamboo leaf to her chest, as if absorbing its strength. Jia saw the hope in his daughter's eyes, a hope that he knew would need to be nurtured every day. But now, with May recovering and under the doctor's care, he felt more prepared than ever to face whatever came next. Time passed, and May began to recover slowly. Her color returned, and her smile became more frequent. The doctors were optimistic, and Jia felt an immense gratitude growing in his heart. He would never forget that day on the road, the day his life and May's had changed forever. The pandas, the elderly man, the wooden box, all had been part of a journey that led them to this moment of renewal and hope. When the day finally came for May to be discharged from a hospital, Jia felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They returned home, the familiar mountains rising on the horizon like ancient guardians. May held the wooden box in her lap, and Jia knew that the small object would continue to be a symbol of everything they had overcome. One afternoon, while May played in the garden, Jia walked into the nearby forest. He followed a small path that led to a stream, the sound of the flowing water bringing back memories of the encounter with the old man. Jia sat by the stream, listening to the soothing sounds of nature around him. He thought of everything that had happened, all the difficulties and the moments when he had almost lost hope. But in the end, kindness and compassion had prevailed. Jia closed his eyes, and in his mind, he visualized the pandas, the mother and her cub, disappearing into the forest. He felt that, somehow, they were at peace, just as he and May were. They had fulfilled their roles in the story, and now it was time for Jia to move forward, with a light heart and a renewed soul. When Jia returned home, he found May sitting on the porch, with a wooden box open in her lap. The bamboo leaf was still there, green and vibrant, just as it had been the day they found it. Jia sat down beside her, and together they looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with colors of fire. "Daddy," May said softly, "I think this leaf is a gift from the pandas. I think they knew we needed help, and that's why they found us that day." Jia smiled and wrapped his arm around his daughter, pulling her closer. "Maybe you're right, my little one. Maybe the pandas were a gift, a reminder that we are never truly alone, even in the hardest times." And there, in the peace of their home, with the mountain and the forest as witnesses, Jia and May sat in silence, feeling the deep connection that had formed between them, the pandas, and the life around them. They knew that no matter how difficult the challenges might be, there would always be hope, there would always be kindness, and there would always be a reason to keep fighting. Because, in the end, life is a gift, as fragile as a bamboo leaf, yet as strong as the love that binds us together.